Greetings, welcome to another session here of Tuzi Talks. Today we're going to be continuing our discussion in the ESL and bilingual methods. Of particular interest today, we will be looking at the different ESL program platforms, the philosophical underpinnings, and then the structure of the platforms for these culturally and linguistically diverse students. You should also know that a lot of this material is coming from the textbook that we're working on, which is this one right over here, Mastering ESL and Bilingual Methods. This is by Herrera and Murray. You can certainly go take a look at that at a bookstore or order it online if you are interested. Today we're going to be looking at these different programs. We'll look at some of the analysis of them, why they came to be, the different types that there are. We'll also look at some of the contributing factors that caused these to emerge. Look at some of the research as well that have caused these. And then we'll look at some of the major types of program platforms, like a traditional ESL or the transitional bilingual, the developmental bilingual, and then immersion. We'll also end by looking at some smaller programs that are used for more specific types of language learning. Before we begin into all this, I want to take a look at some of the political intervention that has occurred that has changed the way language is taught in the United States. And for those of you who are watching these videos overseas, I don't know if this is going to interest you. You may be interested in finding out what your country has with regard to laws and rules for teaching language to your students, whether they're foreign students or whether they're native to your country and they're learning English as a second language or a foreign language. I myself do not like the fact that the federal government is getting involved. Education, according to the Constitution, indicates that the programs that are implemented should be under the control of the states. But that's neither here nor there. These laws and court cases have been put into effect, and they are impacting how language is taught in the United States. Let's begin with the Bilingual Ed Act, which came out in 1968. And that was the first major law that came out that indicated that second language learners who are here trying to live in this country be given be given the opportunity to learn English. So this happened way back in 1968. How quickly that has filtered down into the classrooms, I do not know, but that was the beginning of the process. Then in 1974, there were a bunch of Chinese students in San Francisco who did not think they were getting the treatment that they needed. They felt as if they were being set aside, and so there was a lawsuit, Lau v. Nichols, in 74. And the students won. They were told that they should be given the right to be in the classes and to have adequate opportunities for learning language. They could not be ostracized or set aside. Now, in 1974, there was also a major law that was passed entitled the Equal Educational Opportunity Act. And this act basically looked at what was happening with the students who are learning language and said that's not fair that they're getting substandard learning. They're getting substandard education. And that they should be given the same educational opportunities as everyone else. They should be entitled to teachers and resources and time to learn English. A couple of years after that, in 1981, Costeneda versus Packard was another lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court. And during this time, there were a bunch of Mexican students in Texas who sued because they did not believe they were getting adequate training. In point of fact, they were being minimized and also told that they had to pay money because they were requiring the school to do extra work. And during this lawsuit, the Supreme Court stated that language should not be something that's held over the head of people who are here learning language. And at the same time, this court case solidified the Equal Educational Opportunity Act by giving a test to verify whether the act was actually being implemented properly. And that test included three areas. One was theory. The ESL program that would be implemented had to be implemented based on sound educational research. So they couldn't just set up a program. It had to be based on research. Secondly, there had to be ample practice. The program had to include adequate resources and personnel in order for students to practice and learn the second language. And lastly, most importantly, the results of the program had to be tested. It had to be an effective program not only to provide language education, but also to help students in content areas, including math, science, and social studies. Now, in the state of New York, the programs, TESOL programs, are required to teaching ESL content like math, science, and social studies. And so you have to learn the specific content. Now, fortunately for us, there are people out there that have gone to develop the specifics with regard to teaching content to second language learners. Now, overseas, though, it's typically called content-based instruction. In the United States, because of this act, it was more specific to math, science, and social studies. And we'll look later on in this series at groups like the SIOP protocol or the CALA, Cognitive Academic Language Learning Approach, to better investigate those areas. Lastly, the Plyler and versus Doe was a lawsuit for people who were here illegally. And there were students that were undocumented, they were illegal aliens in the country, and they sued to be able to get free education. Again, this was in Texas, where the Texas municipality basically said, look, these people are not here legally, therefore they are not our responsibility. They do not belong in our municipality, and we're not going to take responsibility for them until they become legal. If we do allow them in, we're going to fine them. And this court case, again, went to the Supreme Court, said, listen, the Fourth Amendment protects all people, and since undocumented children are people, that then they would also be protected, and they should be given the free education, just like every other person would be allowed to have that. So those are some of the political events that have caused the United States now to provide education, tested and reliable ESL education to anyone who is in the country, whether they're here legally or not, whether their first language, whether they have first language background or not, it doesn't matter. The public school systems are now required to provide for that. And that's the program analysis I'll be looking at. Basically, two things we're looking at here. One was the political, and the next one we're going to look at is some of the research. There are a number of research projects out there, research papers that focused on how effective these programs are. And there are a number of programs that we'll look at very soon. But the results very quickly indicated that successful programs had effective teaching of content in both languages, the first language and the second language. So a good program was a program that not only taught language, but taught content and taught it in both languages, the native language and then in English. Additionally, the effective programs were programs where there was a social environment that encouraged interaction for everybody in the school. There was no one group being ostracized. Ostracizing means that you're going to raise the affective filter, and raising the affective filter, of course, is going to limit the amount of language learning that's possible. And so that's the major research that you look at. Part of this information that I'm showing you here actually comes out of a major research study, which you can get off the web. This is where I actually got this particular graphic. You can go take a look at that if you want. But the actual article is also available. There it is. And the study is basically a national study of school effectiveness for language minority students. It was a long-term study. This particular document here is about 300 pages long, but it is available online. You want to go look at it and read about it, you can certainly go ahead and do that and learn more about what the results are. As you look at these results here, we have your traditional two-way, which is basically an immersion, dual language. You have a one-way immersion. And these are, in my opinion, going to be the most popular in most schools. You've got early exit bilingual. In other words, they stay for a little while in bilingual, and then they test out or exit out. early exit traditional ESL, in which there's no bilingual involved, just a teacher who's teaching them in a separate classroom. And then you have content-based ESL, which is basically teaching second language learners using content. You can see also that this is the rank of average reading proficiency for native speakers, and it's only these first two platforms that were more successful than the standard learning that students had in a native speakers have in a normal class. So the immersion programs, long-term immersion programs, were more effective than any of the other systems that are out there. I do not know what your school is using, but as you can see, in the short term here, in the first 3 years of someone came in first grade, they did fine. They kept along with the other students. But as time progressed, those that continued in bilingual or immersion programs fared much better than those who exited early or only did content. Okay, you can see the difference there. This is not open to opinion. This is someone's long-term research. This is a very good research project that was done here, and I do think you should go look at it. This is Thomas and Collier's paper, the one I showed you earlier. So, according to this research, the best systems that are out there are your immersion and your long-term bilinguals. Those would be the best ones that are out there. Another element of their research indicated that a student who comes into your program, okay, in other words, a student who comes from overseas and goes into your classroom, and they have 2 to 3 years of literacy training in their own language, it's going to take them less time. It's going to take them 5 to 7 years to get out to the 50th percentile. Students who come in with 0, it's going to take longer. It's going to take about 10 years for them to get to the 50th percentile. Now, bear in mind, this information that you're looking at does not take into account the first language. As I've shown you on other presentations, students who coming in with a language that's more closely related to English will be able to get to the 50th percentile faster than those who come from a language that's more distant from English. But this is also good to know. Knowing language in the first culture, in the first language, is going to definitely aid them for learning the second language. Another area that they talked about as far as some of their research was this whole idea of cup and sup distinction. I have never heard of this before reading this text. And in my opinion, this is kind of a no-brainer. At least if you study second language acquisition, the only one that makes sense is the common underlying proficiency. But they wanted to spend extra time studying this and investigating it. So we'll take a quick look at this whole idea of separate underlying proficiency and common underlying proficiency. The whole idea here is that in the brain, you have two separate languages and they do not meet, they do not connect. And so that being the case, I don't need to have the two of them together because they're not going to help one another. They don't get information from one another. Whereas in the common underlying proficiency, they're connected, they're related somehow, and so they can learn from one side or the other. And if you study anything about second language acquisition, you know that is obviously true. That there's things called transfer, where you transfer from one language to another, and there are concepts that are wordless, languageless, and they can be applied either way. There are similarities with language, and so this whole idea of a separate underlying proficiency, in my mind, makes absolutely no sense. The only one that does make sense is the common underlying proficiency. Now, that being said, there is evidence out there of this idea, and I went out to this place called SLA Encyclopedia, and you can come here and look at that if you're interested, and they had a whole thing about this, the differences between the separate and the common underlying proficiencies. Basically, the description is there, again, I don't see any rationale for having a separate underlying proficiency, although one of the things that they talk about is that the English-only people, the people who are saying only be teaching in the first language, are saying this because they believe in cup theory. I do not see that at all in the literature. But that's what they're doing here. So they're talking about this here. The cup is underlying characteristics of the cup supports bilingual, and the underlying support theory for SUP or separate supports the English only. I would disagree with that. English only people are doing this for a different reason, and they believe that full immersion in one language is going to help students learn faster. That's one of the things that has not been brought up within this theory, within this series. It's something called the direct method. And within the direct method, there is no target, no native language, no L1 taught at all within the program. Students learn only through the L2. And although this may be true, and they may try to use their L1 in order to understand and do things, the production elements of language in a direct method course does not allow the use of L1 at all. And it can be very successful. I've mentioned in other courses a friend of mine who used to study English in Nepal, and until he was 6 years old, he learned his only language was Nepali. He went into school, and nobody was allowed to speak any Nepali anywhere in the school. Anywhere in the hallways, anywhere in the cafeteria, while you were in school, you spoke English. And if you were caught speaking another language, you got smacked by a variety of sticks. And so when I asked my students at one point, I was teaching a TESOL class overseas, and I asked them, what method did you learn by? The different kinds of methods. And this one student from Nepal raised his hand and he said, I learned via the grandpa method. And of course I went, what? What's the grandpa method? Well, it's all these different sticks that the teacher or the principal had in the school. And you'd get smacked with them if you did something wrong. And in his school, the biggest stick that the teachers had was called grandpa. Okay? Now, just to let you know, this student's English is very good. He learned very well in this direct method. It doesn't mean that there's this idea of separable language learning. It's not separable necessarily. He's bilingual. Actually, he's now trilingual because he also knows Japanese. It doesn't mean that this is separated in that sense. It just meant that the teachers believed in the direct method, which was one language only, and in his case it was English. Okay. So, the distinction between CUP and SUP. Let's move on. There were some other program offering problems. In different parts of the country, at least in the past, I think now it's a little different, there were not enough L2 students to justify a program. So they didn't have enough students, therefore they weren't going to have the program, and you had to endure. You had to suffer. It also may have been that there weren't enough bilingual teachers in order to develop a bilingual program. And that can be a problem. Now, the United States, currently the number one first language is Spanish. But in earlier times, it was a different language. And of course, all of the minority languages that are still here, because there are so many different languages in certain areas, there may not be a bilingual teacher who speaks Farsi or or even Chinese, or depending on where the location is. And that's another problem in offering bilingual programs, is that the locations are too remote. You may have a location that's remote and they have ample students, but they don't have any teachers who will come and move into the area because they're so far from maybe the university where they're studying, or the families that they're in, because they don't want to be in a remote area. So location could be. Too many different types of languages in a given area, especially some city areas where there are upwards of 30, 40 different languages. Well, you can't provide for all of them, and so the major ones can probably get some of that, but not others. There's also some national efforts in the United States in order to push for this idea of English only. And these are people who have more of a political agenda and believe that if you're going to be in this country, you need to learn this language, and we're not going to teach you in the second language. This has some political implications. People who believe that they shouldn't be spending that money and time teaching you in your own language. That should be your responsibility. Well, these people in these groups make it more difficult to set up a bilingual program. In addition, there are some state problems. States who may limit or even eliminate bilingual, not even offer bilingual programs because of financial or political reasons. There are others who will say that it's not as effective, even though a lot of the research indicates that immersion programs are probably the best. And lastly, there may be no local advocates. You may have a group of, Hmong students in, Mississippi, and they're a small group, and there's no one there who will advocate for them. Therefore, there's no one who's going to help them get the bilingual training that might be available to them. Those are some problems in offering a bilingual program. Let's take a look now, switch gears, and take a look at some of these programs that are out there. The most popular, I believe, is going to be your standard ESL program. It is typically a self-contained classroom. So it's not grouped with the main students. It's a self-contained classroom, and students might be there all day. Or they may be pulled out for half a day. Or another type of system that's not necessarily self-contained, teachers literally go into the classroom, the English classroom, with the second language learner, with the English language learner, and assist them in the class. Okay, that person needs to be bilingual. That person needs to understand what the English speaker, the English teacher is saying, and then at the same time be able to translate into the second language. These types of push-in is going to require bilingual, but the all day or the other ones, they're not necessarily going to require someone to be bilingual. That is a plus or a minus, depending on where you're sitting. Again, if you have a classroom and you have a group of students with 5 different languages, being bilingual is not going to be very easy. If most of your students are one language, however, that's going to be advantageous to have a bilingual person in there. These programs also are not necessarily as long, depending on where they are. They could be 2 or 3 years of service. Others have it longer, but if you can test out and go into mainstream. And if you test out, that means that you are sufficient, your language is sufficient that you can survive in mainstream courses. Oftentimes, although not always, these courses, these ESL programs do focus on content. So they focus on math, science, social studies. It's more of a sheltered approach. Sometimes they only focus on language, and that would be less effective, as the research indicates. So one of the major ones out there are just your straight ESL programs. You also have something called Transitional Bilingual. These are also called Early Exit Bilingual Ed. They are bilingual programs, but they only provide bilingual education for a few years, 2 to 3 years. So during those 2 or 3 years, students get bilingual ed. They get things in both their language and in English. If a language learner doesn't have a lot of literacy skills in their first language, then everybody focuses more on listening and speaking initially in both languages. If someone already has some literacy and they can do some reading in their own language, well, then they can move faster and move towards more of the reading and writing. In a bilingual program, just by nature, it lowers the affective filter. This, to me, is a huge plus, because students realize I can communicate in my language if need be, if I desire to. And so the fear factor goes down. I know teaching overseas and having students petrified to come into a classroom because they didn't want to make a mistake. They didn't want to be embarrassed. Well, here, because they can speak in their own language, that fear, that affective filter will definitely come down. That's a big plus. These types of transitional programs, it's a gradual transition where they begin to focus more on reading and writing. They transfer more of the skills from the first language into the second language. Also, obviously, they're showing the differences between the languages. And so there's this gradual transition. There's lots of scaffolding that's going on. There are lots of assessment that's going on. And to me, this should be true of anyone. There should be lots of scaffolding for your students, and you should be providing lots of formative assessments before you get on to the end, just to keep an eye on what do they know, what they don't know. Are they actually learning the materials? So that's transitional. Developmental bilingual programs are less common. They are bilingual ed, but they can go as long as K through 12. Minimum would be a 5-year program. Developmental bilingual seeks to develop both languages throughout the entire public school experience. And so students learn in both languages separately, but they learn in both languages throughout their whole tenure. So they're learning content and language. Now, basically, they're learning the same as a non-bilingual school, but they're learning it in 2 languages. So by the time they're done, they are fully bilingual in both languages. It does require bilingual teachers. obviously. You're not going to be able to teach in both languages if you do not know both of those languages. Just an aside here, I had a friend who grew up in the United States from maybe 7th grade on, and was a Japanese speaker, and by the time they got to high school, their English was more than sufficient. And while they were in the United States, they took a human anatomy course. And, in human anatomy, you learn about the names of all the bones and all the muscles and all the organs. And the student learned all of them for that course and did not know them in her native language. Just really quite interesting, because you would say, you would talk about the ocular nerve, and you would ask that person, how do you say that in Japanese? And they would look at you and say, I have no idea. In a developmental bilingual, they would be able to get both of those, because they're studying both throughout the tenure of their public school experience. In other programs, they're not going to be able to do that. It'll be their responsibility to find some way to learn that specialized vocabulary in their native language. So there's definitely something to be said for the developmental bilingual. Another of the platforms that's possible out there is an immersion program. And in an immersion program, it's similar to bilingual. It's dual language immersion, where you're learning everything in both languages. It has a similar goals. The goal is bilingualism. The goals are cultural appreciation, basically unity. Hey, I can survive and function in both of these languages. But it's immersion. Okay, you're just only staying in those two languages. Typically what happens in many of these programs is that they begin with a 90% in the L1, 10% in the L2. So the majority of the day is, for example, our example here would be majority of the day Spanish. And then gradually you're adding more English as you go, and after a year or 2 years, you're closer to 50-50. So things become more difficult as you go, but you still have this opportunity as you go to learn. So quite an interesting thing. I've seen lots of research on immersion programs. They are very successful, but of course they have more requirements, because you do need bilingual teachers, and you have to have content that's available in both languages. It does require more time to get done. There are also limited use programs. Programs like English for academic purposes. Those are the ones that you typically see at a college. And the main purpose for this program is to get somebody prepared for academic life, the ability to succeed in college. So they're dealing with more of the academic components. You have a lot of ESP programs, English for specific purposes. I once taught at a factory that created tractors when I was overseas, and they had salespeople who wanted to go overseas and sell their product, and so they had to sell their product in English. Well, the whole program was designed for them to be able to interact and talk about their product, and that's all. So that they could go to a conference, or they could go to a convention and talk about their product to anybody who came by, collect information if necessary, but they're not going to be talking about, driving to the store or any of the other typical things that are there, because they're focused on this specific area. You also may have something called survival English. Survival English is somebody comes off the boat. It's like a newcomer program, and they want to be able to get a job, or call the police, or go to the store, or order a pizza, and that's all they want to learn. I actually remember a guy who I met again in Japan, and he wanted to spend a month in Australia because he wanted to go scuba diving and surfing. That was what he wanted to do. And while he was there for that month, he wanted to be able to go into a restaurant, go into a hotel, and maybe just do a little light conversational talk. That's all he wanted to do. So you develop a special program for those people. But they're limited use programs. They're generally not very long. They're generally for older people. But there are those limited use programs that are out there. And that's all I have for this little session here at Tuzi Talks. I do hope that you had a little enjoyment here of looking at some of the various programs that are out there. I do encourage you to go on out and look at some descriptions and definitions of programs out there on the web. And if you do have any questions, please, by all means, drop me a note down below. And you have a good day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.